So if the water freezing inside of a cell pops it open when the ice expands, how on earth do other plants survive this? We'll get into that in a second. Hi, I'm Rachel, and welcome back to Auxhart Gardening. Today I'm answering the question, why are some plants frost hardy when others just aren't? So to answer this question, I'm going to divide plants up into 4 major categories. We've got the cold hardy, the frost tolerant, the frost sensitive, and the warm loving plants. We're going to start with warm loving plants, talk about what they are and why frost kills them. Alright, so the first 2 categories we have are warm loving and frost sensitive. Now, both of these categories are not going to survive a frost, but they have different tolerances of cold. So a warm loving plant will only tolerate down to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas a frost sensitive plant can tolerate all the way down to like 30, 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty cold, but definitely not at the freezing point. Both categories of these plants also require warm temperatures to germinate and will always produce better for you in warmer weather. As I found out with my peppers this year, even though they survived cooler temperatures, they were stunted for the entire season because I exposed them to cold temperatures early in the spring. So some examples of warm loving plants, we have of course your peppers, your eggplants, squash, okra, and melons. All of these things are warm loving. And in the frost sensitive category, we have corn, tomatoes, beans. Most of your herbs are going to be frost sensitive or slightly frost tolerant, and most flowers as well are going to be frost sensitive. So why are these plants so frost sensitive? Well, let's start with the cells inside the plant. So like all living things, plants are made of cells. And if you flash back to your freshman biology class, you might remember that plants have cell walls. In the textbooks, they were always drawn kind of square with the thick green edge. But basically, that's a very rigid outer edge of a cell that a lot of mammalian cells don't have because they're lipid bilayers instead of a cell wall. But beside the point. So when water inside of these cells freezes, it expands. And if you think to what would happen if you put a full bottle of water in the freezer, you may come back to it and find that the plastic has cracked because as water freezes, it expands. And so if you imagine that your cell wall is your water bottle in the freezer and that water freezes, it expands and cracks those cell walls open. And once that has happened, there's really no going back. Even if it warms back up, again, if you warm up your water bottle again, it's still going to be cracked and the water is going to leak out, and there's not much you can do about that. And the plants can't physically repair themselves fast enough to not just die when this happens. So when you come back to your plants after a frost, you may notice that they're very mushy, and that is why all of the structure has just popped from the ice. So if the water freezing inside of a cell pops it open when the ice expands, how on earth do other plants survive this? We'll get into that in a second. So our last 2 categories are frost tolerant and cold hardy. And so your frost tolerant plants are the ones that can tolerate some frost but don't like to be cold for very long. So these are plants such as peas, celery, radish. These things thrive in cold temperatures and aren't going to die immediately if it gets a little frosty, but they don't like it very much. I've seen this on my own radishes. The top part of the radish that sticks out of the soil, after cold nights, you'll see the outer layer of the radish just like flaking off. Like it's not dead, it's still edible, but it's not very happy. And frost tolerant plants can't really tolerate anything much below freezing at all. Sometimes you'll get plants that can handle down to like 30, 28 degrees Fahrenheit, but for a simply frost tolerant plant, that's going to be the lower limit for what it can tolerate. And again, it can't tolerate that for very long. And so then we move into the truly cold hardy plants. These are plants that can tolerate freezing and well below freezing temperatures for extended periods of time. For example, kale can tolerate down to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Cabbage is 15 to 20-ish degrees Fahrenheit. Carrots are about 15. Cauliflower down to about 10. Collards can go down to about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Parsnips all the way down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit in some cases. Onions down to about 20. And garlic can overwinter at temperatures all the way down to negative 30 degrees. And that's mostly because the tops die off and the root survives in the frost. But for the most part, these plants are surviving because the cell walls don't break when it freezes. So back to how is this possible? So let's revisit a little bit of our high school chemistry. So in these plants, there is a fairly high concentration of sugar in the waters that make up the plant. And long story short, when you add sugar to water, it lowers the freezing point. The longer story is that when ice tries to form, it tries to form this lattice. And when there's sugar molecules in the way, basically that just disrupts the forming of the lattice such that it is chemically favorable not to freeze for a very long time. So plants with higher concentrations of sugar molecules disrupting the forming of that lattice are going to have a lower freezing point than plants that have only a few of those sugar molecules. That's why we have the distinction between the cold hardy plants and the frost hardy plants, and then your frost sensitive, and then your warm loving. So it's a gradient of higher sugar content to lower sugar content in the plant. So this is why we have our spring gardens and our summer gardens, especially in zones where you have a somewhat cold winter and a somewhat warm summer. You really have to switch back and forth between these cold hardy crops and these warm loving crops in order to grow a wide variety of things in your zone. In some of the colder zones, you're looking at cold hardy only during the winter because that's the only thing that'll survive. In some zones like mine, I can plant frost tolerant and cold hardy stuff pretty much all winter. And then if you're in a much warmer zone, then you're looking at what is the most warm loving thing I can plant during the summer. And then you're growing all of these frost sensitive, frost tolerant things all the way through your winter. And while there are some extreme cases of climates that can only ever grow stuff that can tolerate frost and stuff that can't, most of us are kind of in the middle where we have to do this trade-off every year. And that's part of what you have to think about as a gardener when you're planning things out. All right, and that is your gardening chemistry lesson for the day. I hope you found this as interesting as I did, and I hope you found it helpful as we move into starting to plan our spring gardens. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. But until then, I wish you happy gardening.